I put this slideshow on the internet at this URL, so you can go there and check it out if you so desire. And I guess the other thing, make sure I know how to use this. Maybe not.
Yes, the right hand one.
The right one, okay. How many of you are familiar with Edgar Cayce? Let me get a little survey so I know almost everybody? Good. Okay, well, as you're probably aware, he manifested many forms of psychic ability in ESP, almost the full range. And if you're interested in that aspect of the examples of ESP, you might want to check out Kevin Tedeschi's book on, he does a nice job of categorizing and documenting Edgar Cayce's ESP. I'm going to focus more on the psychic process, but I will be getting into some examples as well. Now, in terms of the outline of my talk, the first section will be anatomy and physiology, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about glands and nerves and chakras or whatever, and Kundalini life force energy, which was seemed to be the driving force that powered his trance channel, or whatever you want to call it. We'll also look at some personal and interpersonal factors, the set and setting of the readings, the transpersonal soul aspects, including past lives and astrological sojourns and some other sort of interesting things. I'll have a little section on chronology effects in the physical readings, which was very important to me when I did health research with the Meridian Institute, and that also gives us a little bit of a window into his psychic process, I think, as well. We'll wrap up with some implications. What difference does it make if we know how he did what he did, and how could that apply to other people in other settings, historically as well as currently? So he gave over 14,000 of these readings, most of which were physical readings, of course. And that's what I've spent most of my time on, although I have worked with some of this other information. And it made a difference. The physical readings were different. His psychic process was somewhat different for the physical readings than for the life readings, which I'll allude to as we go along. Anatomy and physiology. To understand Edgar Cayce's psychic process, you really need to grasp his concept of the body-soul connection. That the soul connects in through definite anatomical centers in the body, particularly through the sympathetic nervous system, this nervous system that's outside the brain, along the spinal column and in the body cavity. He called it the brain manifestation of the soul forces, the brain of the soul, in other words. Very important for the psychic process. The endocrine glands, he talked about being spiritual centers, and particularly the pineal and Leydig, which he called the seat of the soul. And of course the sensory system, which he said in most cases, the sensory system focuses outward into the world, but when he gives his trance readings, it became introspective and looked within. So we'll be coming back to those as we go along. I'm going to begin with his first psychic reading, which is documented on page 50 of There Is a River. And Edgar Cayce considered this to be his first psychic reading when he was about 14 or 15 years old. It was during an acute manic episode due to a spinal injury. And this is at about that point in his life when he was sort of communing with this angelic figure who encouraged him to sleep with his head on his book so he could learn his lessons, because he was not a very good student up to this point. In fact, his father was sort of getting after him in a pretty harsh way about it. And so he went from being the worst student in the class to a genius because he had a photographic memory. He could remember everything in his books. And you can imagine his teacher at school wondering about this, what happened. And his teacher, actually, Mr. Tom, questioned him about this during a recess period. And of course, Edgar Cayce didn't have a clue, and so he told him to go on out and play in the playground. He went out and got involved with sort of a baseball game where he was running the bases. They called it Old Sal. When I was growing up, we called it Hot Box, I think. And he was running, and he got hit on the end of the spine with a baseball. Now, I take the end of the spine to be the tailbone end of the spine. There is another end of the spine, of course, but I think if he would have got hit on the back of the head, they would have just said that. And you'll see, as we talk about the Kundalini energy and so forth, why I think that's the case. So he got hit with a baseball. I went back into the classroom, and he had a complete change of personality from being sort of shy and retiring. He was laughing and carrying on and throwing spitballs, and was just almost dominating the class, it sounds like. And the teacher felt kind of guilty, thinking that maybe by asking these questions, he had triggered this somehow. And so the teacher didn't discipline him or keep him after school. And on the way home from school, he rolled on the ground. He jumped into ditches. He went out and flagged down the wagons, laughing. When he got home, his mother was in the kitchen making coffee with the coffee beans in the skillet. And the text says he took the skillet, unmindful of the heat, took it out in the yard and started planting the coffee beans in the yard. came back in, had, sounds like food fights and at the dinner table and was laughing uproariously. And usually his father is a strict disciplinarian, but everyone was just sort of in awe of this energy that was coming out of him until they put him to bed. Then he completely changed again. This time he became serious and described that he had experienced a shock to the system and told him that they need to make a poultice out of some common kitchen ingredients and put it on the back of his head. Now in the readings, he described over and over this reflex from the tailbone up to the base of the brain. And so he said there was a congestion forming there, and if they did that, he would be okay. Well, they did it. They put him to bed. They had to pull the bed away from the wall because he was banging against the wall. He was afraid he would hurt himself. And he was, throughout the night, he would wake up and yell, "Hurrah for Cleveland." Of course, this is Grover Cleveland. His father had encouraged him to, made him memorize all these political texts and so forth. And so he did this through the night. When he woke up in the morning, he was perfectly normal, but he couldn't remember anything that had happened from the day before at recess. And so Edgar Cayce believed this to be his first psychic reading, according to Harmon Brough, where he actually diagnosed and prescribed for himself in that acute manic episode. And so I do want to be clear, I don't think Edgar Cayce was mentally ill. I think he was working with some very powerful forces, psychic and mystic forces, and he had some tendencies to sort of manic depressive sort of things going on for almost his entire life, particularly on the depressive side. But he was not mentally ill because he kept a balance. He had a high level of functioning, and I actually give lectures on this, on mysticism and madness, and I use Edgar Cayce as an example of how to keep your balance if you're going to work with this kind of process. Now, there's some interesting parallels between Edgar Cayce's psychic process and the Book of Revelation. And this actually came up with a young woman that came in 1929 to the hospital up here, and she apparently was suffering from mania. And Edgar Cayce told the osteopathic physician to pay attention that she was cycling with the phases of the moon, and at certain phases of the moon there would be this wild, hilarious reaction. Of course, this is mania. Now, in historical times, this would have been called lunacy. Luna, the moon, lunacy, a lunatic. Now we call it mania or maniac. And so in quite a few, I found a number of cases in the Cayce readings where he drew this correspondence between raising this energy and various other factors and this manic sort of energy. And actually in the Cayce readings, he recommended studying the Revelation if you would understand this sort of process, and using Gray's Anatomy as a textbook, as a resource when you're studying the Revelation. He said the body will interpret the Revelation. So it's a little bit a different take on the Revelation than sort of the end times and apocalyptic sort of interpretations you see in the world today. Now, in this particular case with this young woman, he talked about a pressure at the lower part of the spine that was affecting the pineal gland, and essentially she was having the revelation herself, the same sort of mystical experience that John was having with all these fantastic symbols and images. She was experiencing that. It had been awakened within her somehow because of this pressure on the spine and this activity through the pineal gland. And he told the doctor to study the revelation, to learn this physical body, the spiritual and mental body as well, and not just metaphysical. In other words, there was something of a definite anatomical and physiological process here. He described how the mental body is raised through various degrees of consciousness through the correlated centers of the body, which I described earlier as these spiritual centers, the endocrine glands. And he was using this biblical sort of imagery along with the sympathetic system, the inner court, the holy mount, the pineal gland, with the sympathetic forces. Now, he gave readings for other people. For example, here's a case where he was describing this psychic ability, the second sight, or the superactivity of the third eye, with the opening of this Leyden or Leydig gland and the Kundalini forces moving along through the pineal. Now, his concept of the pineal was more than just a gland in the center of the brain. He considered the pineal to be almost a system in itself. It included the gland, it had a cord or thread that moved through the spine and through the system and sort of coordinated with this Leyden or Leydig center. And even the sympathetic ganglia along the spine, he called them pineal centers. So this is very important. Now, I ran into this in medical research because this is where you would do the therapies. You would attach the wet cell battery or do the spinal manipulation or the various other therapies to these pineal centers along the spine. Here's another example of someone who is apparently perceiving past lives, and he's talking about this Kundalini energy moving through the centers of the body. Now, in terms of Edgar Cayce's psychic process, he used the same sort of language as we've seen in the Revelation and some of these other cases, with this gland with its thread known as the pineal gland. And with the subjugation of the consciousness, the physical consciousness, there's this movement along this thread or cord. When severed, separates the physical, the soul, or spiritual body. And then uses the senses of the body in an introspective manner, looks within. So he's describing this silver cord. You may have heard of it in the metaphysical literature, in some of the yogic and other traditions. This is operating through him in his psychic process. Harmon Brough described it, who witnessed quite a few readings actually, and wrote a PhD dissertation on Edgar Cayce, described it as a near to a death coma, almost a small dying that he would enter into, a very fragile state. And in one case, he had a very extraordinary physical reaction because of asking irrelevant questions. So even something as just asking a silly question or an improper question could have almost a convulsive effect on him physically, as it was in this case. And he's describing the psychic forces along the pineal, the Leiden, and the cord, or the silver cord. And so there's almost this death-like state when he says this cord is severed. That's when the soul departs the body. He's describing that similar kind of process here. It's a very fragile sort of thing. Here's one illustration of that. I'm not saying that's exactly what Edgar Cayce did, but apparently he did. Some part of him did leave his body, because in one case they passed a piece of paper over his body, and that was enough to throw him almost into a convulsion. And so he described actually almost being out of body while he's giving these readings. Now, essentially what I'm describing here is a life force energy in the body that we all have, and it's in a raised vibration naturally in certain circumstances of life, cycles of growth and development, and particularly in childhood and adolescence. Now, in some readings he talked about how this energy would come up during adolescence, and if it got out of balance it could result in schizophrenia or such. And so those are natural sort of things, along with sleep and dreams and sexual orgasm, gestation and pregnancy and creativity, that this energy would naturally come up. And we're really not aware of it being anything all that strange. It's maybe wonderful, yes, in many respects, but it's natural. In other situations, when this energy comes up, and we call it Kundalini, it's much sort of a special sort of thing when we're having psychic experience, such as past life recall, telepathy, or precognition, or mystical experiences, cosmic consciousness, Kundalini yoga, but it can also have sort of a dark side with spiritual emergency or Kundalini crisis, psychic heat, or mental illness such as mania. And I have worked with people with these last three situations in public and private mental health situations. So I'm talking about this Kundalini energy, and it's described as a serpent in some of the literature that's coiled at the base of the spine, sort of latent or sleeping, and can arise and move up the spine and produce a flash of light, such as Gopi Krishna described in some of his literature. Now, this is the process this was what happened at an anatomical and physiological level when Cayce gave his readings. And he would actually describe that he had to get this flash of light early as he was entering the trance, where he couldn't give the reading. Another indication of a Kundalini manifestation. Of course, you probably relate this somewhat to chakras and the Kundalini and the yogic tradition, if you're familiar with that. So we're talking essentially about a Western version of this in the Edgar Cayce readings and in his psychic process. Only he's talking anatomy and physiology, as we're more aware of, as endocrine glands and particularly the sympathetic nervous system, leading to enlightenment, which is the point of the revelation, is enlightenment. And so I created a DVD called Rivers of Light, documenting as best I could the Cayce approach to the revelation as being the process of enlightenment. And I've also, I gave a talk here which was recorded on House of Clay, the body-soul connection, where I go into a lot of detail on the glands and the nerves and how it all works in various circumstances of life, including Edgar Cayce's psychic process. So you can follow up on that if you're interested. Now, in terms of personal and interpersonal factors, here's a kind of an outline given by Yulin Cayce the son of Edgar Cayce, and it's a pretty good description. Cayce lies on his back crosses his hands over the solar plexus. Actually, Edgar Cayce himself, he said he would start with his hands over his forehead, sort of over the third eye, and that's where he would get the flash of light. And if he didn't get the flash of light, he couldn't give the reading. So presumably he's raising this Kundalini energy. And then he would put his hands over the solar plexus, breathe deeply several times, and enters a trance. Suggestions would be given to him, the name, the location of the individual seeking information, and so forth. And then Cayce would repeat it over in a low tone, and then after a few seconds, he would start to give the reading. It would generally take about 3 minutes to become unconscious, 30 to 50 minutes for the reading, and a few seconds to awaken usually. But sometimes he had a lot of trouble coming out of trance, and he would get kind of stuck in that death-like state and be in almost a coma for hours at a time, which was very frightening for the people, for his family, for sure. It required a conductor to give the suggestions and a stenographer to write down the words. So it wasn't just Edgar Cayce, there was a social network here that was very important in his process. And without that, he couldn't have done what he did. Harmon Brough liked to use the word collaboration for what his psychic process was about. Now, the primary factors that affect a reading: the attitude, desire, and type of information sought by the one asking for a reading. The attitude of Edgar Cayce, the mental state of the conductor, which was preferably passive, and Gertrude Cayce was probably the best at that, but Lin and various other people did it as well. And there had to be a desire to be of aid in those present in the room. See, again, the collaboration aspect of it. And of course, the hypnotic suggestion itself, and they use different type of hypnotic suggestions for the different types of readings, depending on what the need was. Now here's a kind of a physical reading, which is kind of interesting from an ESP standpoint, because he almost seems to be doing remote viewing here. Yes, not bad-looking pajamas. And then he goes on to describe the bronchi and the trachea and goes into the anatomy and physiology and pathology of the reading. So I guess there could be like some remote viewing and clairvoyance both kind of going on here in terms of accessing this. Now, the physical reading, the process seemed to be that he needed to know where the person was, where their body was. He wanted them to be in a attuned state, and he would go to them. And if they weren't there, he would have trouble giving the reading. And sometimes he would say, well, they're walking down the street and we'll wait for them. Or they're someplace else. Or he would give details about the surroundings. And this is the sort of thing Kevin documents in his books. And there's quite a bit of that, because they would contact the people to see was it accurate or not. And more often than not, it was very accurate. He could be very accurate describing that. Of course, in the health reading, we're interested inside the body. Was he accurate about that? And as near as we can tell, when they were able to get information back from physicians and so forth that attended, he had a fairly high rate of accuracy in describing anatomy, physiology, and pathology. One of the things I really appreciate about the Cayce material is the objectivity. He didn't want it to become a cult, and his two sons, I think, really exemplify this with the book, The Outer Limits of Edgar Cayce's Power. So they're writing this book about their father and all his failures. I guess you could look at that in a very sorts of way, depending on if you want to do psychoanalytic sort of interpretation or whatever. But the thing that I appreciate is that they think you can learn something about Edgar Cayce's psychic process by looking at when it didn't go so well. And so we're going to there was a couple of cases there where he actually gave readings for dead people, but he forgot to mention that when he gave the readings. And so I'm going to take one of those cases and look through it, because I think we can learn quite a bit about his psychic process from this apparent failure. It was for a 4-year-old girl with leukemia, and she had died the day before the reading. And of course, he didn't say anything about that in the reading. And the reading was conducted by Mildred Davis. Now, she was not one of the people that typically conducted readings. In fact, I'm not aware that she conducted any other readings. I think she was the cousin of Gladys Davis, the stenographer, and they didn't get along so well sometimes. And even after the reading, Gladys criticized her pretty severely for not doing a very good job of conducting the reading. This was even before they knew that there was a problem with the reading. The reading was not requested by anyone close to the girl, and was not given to the family or doctor. In fact, a woman requested this reading, specifically asked that they not give it to the family and not give it to doctors. In other words, she was not interested in helping this child at all. And the suggestion was read from a newspaper clipping. So he didn't go out and make this contact with the person like he would typically do giving a physical reading that I was describing earlier. They actually got a follow-up reading after they found out, that this girl had been dead, as to what went wrong here. And Cayce said it had to do with the desire of the one seeking the reading, the lady that requested the reading. She was not interested in helping this child. She was not interested in actually getting a reading for the child itself. She was more interested in leukemia and making this big, spectacular medical breakthrough. You see, what her motivation was there. And so Edgar Cayce did not give the reading for the child, he gave it for the condition. And what causes the condition, and what could cure it from an experimental scientific standpoint. Which is, again, very interesting to me. You see, the interactivity and the collaboration is really important here, and what the motivation of the person seeking the information would draw that through Edgar Cayce. So the sick person did not request the reading. The hypnotic suggestion was based on a written document preceding the reading date by several days. There was not that personal contact. The desire to be spectacular by that woman, and the suggestion was directed to the disease condition, and there was friction going on within the people in the room, you see? So in terms of his psychic process, almost everything went wrong, you see? In terms of all the things that he would recommend that they would typically say, this is what we need to do to get a good reading, all that went against him. And nevertheless, he still gave probably a pretty good reading on leukemia and what to do about it if you're a medical researcher, because that was the desire of the lady, you see? Now, in terms of some of the transpersonal aspects, I've described a little bit the physical reading and how the process for that, how he sort of went out of body to where the location where the person was. When they requested a life reading, he described, he had a number of dreams and other sort of experiences while he was giving the readings that described going up through this inverted cone, or a funnel, as it's called, as a little beam of light. And there were levels, almost like planes or whatever, which would be dark, and it could be very frightening. And he said when he entered this trance state, very often a wave of fear would go through him. And so there was fear associated with this, and he's moving like a little beam of light, and there's sometimes like grotesque figures reaching out to grab him as he's moving up through this cone. As he gets to the higher levels, it gets brighter, and there's music and bird singing and happy people. It eventually gets to this library where a librarian, this old man, reaches up and pulls the book off the shelf and gives it to him, and this is the information for the life reading. Of course, this is symbolic. This was given, this interpretation, he requested a reading to explain it. And it said, this is symbols that you can understand of your process. But see, that's a little different process than a physical reading in terms of going to get information, presumably from the Akashic records or some other source. And you see the similar sort of cone here, or whatever you want to call it, this geometry of the physical body, the mental or astral body, the spiritual body. Presumably he made this trek through this, almost like a shaman's journey, the shamanic sort of quest. And of course, if you link those together like that, then you get a sense of conscious, subconscious, superconscious levels of consciousness and how we're all connected. So in a physical reading, to be able to make that journey out and connect in through the subconscious or the superconscious of another individual, presumably that's the sort of process he used for physical readings. And he actually said, this is coming from the subconscious of the person that we're giving the reading for. Whereas the life reading was maybe perhaps more of the universal. Sometimes this is illustrated like this star with the points, where each soul is a point of the star, sort of pushed out in its own individuality, and yet connected to the whole. So if you can make that journey back to the center, you have access to other souls, the unconscious of other souls, as well as the universal consciousness. The sources of information, the subconscious mind of Edgar Cayce, of course, and this comes through, I'll allude to that a little bit, especially in terms of his beliefs and values and some of his religious notions. The subconscious minds of individuals in the earth plane, as we've described. The subconscious minds of discarnate entities in the spirit plane, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. The soul minds of higher masters, the Akashic records, the universal or pure cosmic consciousness. These were some of the sources of the information described in the readings themselves. Now, what kind of interested me from a psychological standpoint, very often he would begin the reading by saying, yes, we. Yes, we have the body. Yes, we have the records. Yes, we have the entity or whatever. So who, from a psychological standpoint, trying to understand his psychic process, who are the we? And so one way of thinking about this in terms of selfhood is the multiplicity of personality and individuality, and that we are all have this capability for multiple personalities, which is like his life reading suggestion here. And also the former appearances in the earth, that these are actual plurals. So we have the capability, we're all multiple personalities and multiple individualities, which in his life readings came out as Ra-Ta, this Egyptian priest, and Yult, a Persian seer, presumably. And so some of this may have been something he'd carried over from a past life. Also, he described astrological sojourns, particularly in Uranus, the psychic influence, and he described the multi-dimensional aspects of that all these planets have multi-dimensions. So we're not going there in a physical body, but in some type of multi-dimensional body. And I've documented this in a cosmology DVD I did on Edgar Cayce, so if you're interested in that, you can follow up. And he did have a lot of Uranus in his astrological influences. And of course, the Uranian influences were extremes, and so you kind of can get this periods of depression and exaltation. And it wasn't described specifically for him, but maybe that was part of his psychic makeup. In terms of this multidimensional selfhood of the entity, he used all these terms to describe the inner self or whatever. So perhaps this is part of this we within himself, that is some type of gestalt of the entity. Of course, there are quite a few readings where he actually tapped clearly various discarnate entities. Like in this case, almost every other paragraph is a different entity coming through. And Auspinski there was Peter Auspinski, who authored Tertium Organum. Now this is for Adele Blumenthal, Morton Blumenthal's wife. Here is a dream interpretation that Morton Blumenthal was requesting, and and Edgar Cayce said, so many crowd in. And when he followed up on that, it was actually explained, Morton Blumenthal was asking the question, and he seemed to sort of influence Edgar Cayce's answer to that, and made Edgar Cayce more sort of susceptible or vulnerable to this crowding in. Here's a reading where a group of individualities or personalities, including Confucius, as well as Ra and Ra-Ta and John, were part of this group. And the recommendation was to ask if they were present when you requested information, which Gertrude Cayce did in the next reading, the 11th reading of that series. And there was a description of how these individualities were guiding the information, but also how there was quite a bit of fear based on the Christian sort of background of Edgar Cayce about channeling entities and so forth. So the sources here pointed out this is John the Beloved, the disciple of Jesus. So therefore you can rest assured that this is our own Christian concept is going to be well represented. And of course in Cayce's readings you get a lot of this King James English coming through from his own conscious and unconscious as a Sunday school teacher and someone who had read the Bible once for every year of his life. So this is part of that unconscious, conscious process of Edgar Cayce coming through. Sometimes you would get, here's Jeremiah, presumably an Old Testament prophet, coming through for the first time but not the last. And then the next day, Jeremiah came through again. That first reading, I think, was for Atlantic University, by the way. So Michael, the Archangel, came through on occasion, apparently, in a very booming voice. Halaliel came through. This is the Search for God readings for the study group. And came through several times, actually, claiming to be from the universal forces. He's the one that made the dramatic earth change predictions. And so there's some controversy as to how valid that information is coming through him. Some people think he's great, some people don't. And he had a reading for Eileen Garrett, the famous psychic. They gave each other readings. And it's very interesting in terms of what's going on. And apparently at the end of the reading, they asked where the information was coming from when Edgar Cayce gave it, and Halaliel apparently was. I wish they would have asked that question at the end of every reading he gave, you see, because if they hadn't asked that question, you wouldn't have known. Now, Uvani, the guide for Eileen Garrett, said Edgar Cayce did this primarily on his own, and that he actually recommended that Cayce use a guide or a channel. It would be much easier and less stressful for Edgar Cayce, but Edgar Cayce really didn't want to do that, and apparently didn't. And Halaliel is actually regarded as an obstruction, and the people in that study group chose not to use that as a source of information. And there's the Norfolk study group number 1. They wrote a book about their work with the information, and there's many other books been published, and I've actually created a couple of DVDs. I'm going to be using the Searching for God 1 in an AU course in January. And in Searching for God 3, there's a section on the psychic soul, which is because these people in the study group wanted to become psychic. That was part of their motivation for doing that study group. Psychic is of the soul, is of the creative force, is the God force. That's the premise of the Cayce readings, is that it has to do with soul and spirituality, is the true nature of the psychic experience. In doing the health information from a medical side, of course, I had to deal a lot with the physical readings, and I found out chronology really does matter. You need to pay attention to when the reading was given because it changed over time. And a lot of that had to do with what was going on in the life of Edgar Cayce with him and the people around him. There was changing in terminology. The 10th cranial nerve used to be called the pneumogastric. He said now they're calling it the vagus, so that's what we're going to call it. So he was tracking this stuff and paying attention. And I had to actually go back and research all these medical therapies and so forth at his time to be able to understand the readings, because they're speaking that language. Here's a complex herbal tonic that was typical for the 1920s for someone with poor assimilations. And when I graphed these out, the number of readings like Kalasaya, you see how that tails off. So in the latter part of his life, in his career, there are hardly any readings mentioning that. And when I checked it out historically, it was not available. These herbs were not so available with a local druggist. And they were replaced by substances like products like acid-gest and calcios. And I found that there was a pattern for this, that a man in 1938 asked Edgar Cayce at the end of his reading if it would be good to tell other people about these products because they had helped him. And Edgar Cayce says, yes, it's always good to pass that kind of information along. Now, these products were never mentioned in the readings until a couple of months later. Edgar Cayce requested a product brochure in June and actually ordered the products, and the first reading was given on the day he ordered the products. And so after that point, 254 readings recommended acid-gest and calcios. You see, so there's an interactive sort of thing going on here with these people. I found the same thing with the Tomidine. I found the same thing with an appliance called a radial appliance, which started out like that and ended up like that. The people who were involved in making these had input into the process and affected the readings. And I gave a talk on this, and you can go to my website under the chronology if you're interested. There's a video of the whole talk with a lot of details. Now, in terms of implications, we need to keep the body healthy, particularly the endocrine glands and the sympathetic nervous system, if you want to be able to do it safely. Keep a spiritual focus for using the energy, stay grounded and socially connected. Pay attention to chronology effects, particularly if you're doing the health information. I really, that's just essential. And I think it's very interesting if you're going to look at historical sources like the biblical tradition and so forth, with angels as messengers. And particularly I'm fascinated by Muhammad and his psychic process when he basically Gabriel dictated the Quran to him. Because looking at the Cayce readings and understanding all the factors that can affect Edgar Cayce, and then look at Muhammad, I see the same sort of patterns in the people around him, the circumstances of his life, the psychophysiology, and all the rest. It sheds an entirely different understanding of that. So in conclusion, Edgar Cayce's psychic process was complex and variable. It was influenced by many factors, both internal and external. There were definite chronological patterns that can help to explain variability. Understanding Cayce's process may shed light on psychic phenomena in religious and spiritual traditions, and the Cayce approach offers a spirituality-based model for psychic development. He said, I don't do anything that you can't do if you're willing to pay the price. So hopefully you have a little better idea what he did and a little bit of the price maybe that he paid in doing that. Here are some links to online resources if you're interested in following up on any of this. So I almost made it on time.
You did well. Thank you.
Okay.
In your presentation of the parallel between the Kundalini ideas and Edgar Cayce's experience. Has there been any careful comparison, let's say, to the experiences of Cayce and to someone like Gopi Krishna?
Actually, not other than myself. And when I do give this talk on mysticism and madness, I actually go into a lot of this in detail. And I use quotes from Gopi Krishna because Gopi Krishna had this, in some ways, a similar experience where he practiced Kundalini yoga for years and then had this Kundalini awakening, and he was not prepared for it, and it overwhelmed him. And he became sort of mentally ill for a period of time before he regained his balance, and then went on to write a lot of these books about his experiences and had this high creative period in his life. And so, and he recognized the same sort of pattern, that this could manifest in a very bad way or a very positive way, but it's a spectrum of the same energy, which I've not really seen that anyplace else, but I do get into that in my own talks and some of the stuff I've written, I think, actually may actually quote Krishna a little bit. That's why I included that photo of his book, because that image of the Kundalini coming up in the flash of light, that's what Edgar Cayce got when he started to go into trance. Clearly. I was just reading, I went back up to the library before my talk just to clarify that in my own mind. He wrote a book on what I believe. And there it was on about page 23, the flash of light when he did this. And if he didn't get it, he couldn't give the reading. But it was a delicate balance. He said, he commented how this was like an eggshell, this process. And if they weren't careful, it could end up very badly for him. And so he walked that line. It was, he put himself in harm's way. There was a price to be paid for sure. And so just be aware of that. And I work with people, when I worked in the mental health system with people with psychotic disorders and had a private practice where I saw a lot of people coming from here, and there was quite a bit of overlap. People having Kundalini crisis, spiritual emergencies, psychic heat, and so forth, or even sort of manic sort of features, where they got this out of balance. That's why I use Edgar Cayce's life as an example, how to stay in balance, keep the balance if you're going to work with these high energies. Okay? Great question, thank you. Does that answer your question, by the way?
I was wondering, were there any significant differences between Cayce's phenomenology and Gopi Krishna's?
Okay, so were there any differences? There was similarities, I would say. The main difference was that he had a system and he was trying to work within that system. He knew, being in India, they have systems to do this. And Edgar Cayce didn't have a system. He was a child that got hit with a baseball on the end of the spine out in the playground, went to a manic episode, and started having problems with his voice and losing his voice, and he had to find his way along the way, whereas Krishna had the organization, how to do the breathing and all the rest, and still managed to get out of balance with it. So that would be, of course, Cayce created a system in a way, and that's why I'm trying to describe the revelation was his system, and the study groups, the Search for God study groups and the Glad Helpers and the readings he gave for those were the foundation and the structure for how to go about psychic development and working with this energy. So since he created a Western version of these yogic traditions that Krishna had inherited. And beyond that, I'm not sure.
Any other questions?
Since you've made this such an in-depth study, do you yourself use the system? And in fact, do you consider yourself a psychic? What is your success like, and so on?
Right. Okay. That's sort of the question that when I worked in the mental health system, some of my clients would say, well, I have to take, I hear voices and I have to take medication. Why don't you have to take medication for your voices? Sort of thing. And I actually have a CD. I recorded a talk. I gave a talk on my psychic experiences here and recorded it. And so I've experienced pretty much the full range of psychic phenomena, including out-of-body and precognition and all that sorts of thing. And I work with the energy quite a bit from a creative energy standpoint, consciously. And so the Cayce approach gives me a structure for that, kind of a safe container to work with. I feel safe. And having worked in the mental health system, I've seen mania up close and personal, believe me, a lot of it. So I know what it is, and if I start to sense those tendencies within myself or whatever, working with this energy, it does, I feel safer about it. And some people, and I actually have to intervene with some people to help them get back in balance and develop that self-awareness when this energy comes up. and you have a certain type of experience, this may be going on. So try to monitor this because it can get you in trouble. Okay? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I might follow up with one more, though, if there's time.
Okay. And by the way, when I give this talk on mysticism and madness that I've described before, that I've given many times, I get into this in a lot of detail with some of my own experiences as well as other sort of things.
Bob Monroe also had a system, as you know, with hemisync system, and I see some parallels between what you said and some of the research Bob Monroe did, and I wonder if you have maybe studied that at all, and whether or not you find the same similarities.
Yeah, I've read some of Monroe's books. In fact, the first time I had a Kundalini experience where the Kundalini came up, I'd been meditating at 2 o'clock in the morning. I went back to bed and I laid down on my right side, and the Kundalini started to come up for the first time, really powerful. It was like static electricity. It started out like a buzz in my spine, and as it came up, it became louder and louder until it became a thunderous roar, and it was like the space shuttle taking off. And as it came up, it got louder and louder, and I realized this is Kundalini. This is big time. And I also had read Gopi Krishna and these other books, so I knew I was not in control of it. It was very powerful. It's sort of like John's revelation. So again, I relate that to the sensory sort of phenomenon in John's revelation, the thunder and the earthquakes and stuff. This came up, and as it came up, I had a flash of light, and then I went out of body spontaneously. I wasn't trying. I went around to the end of the bed, and I looked over and saw myself lying in the bed and realized that I could go anywhere I want. But I'd read Robert Monroe. The funny things that occurred to me, the Gopi Krishna and Robert Monroe came to me having read this, and I realized I could go off and explore, but I thought, no, this is enough for me. I'm kind of a coward, because Robert Monroe describes some pretty interesting things. And the second time I had that similar sort of experience, the same thing, and I remembered Robert Monroe. Now that I can go out, I can go exploring here. I know I can, but I just dove back into my body. And so basically a coward, I guess, a little bit when it comes to compared to Monroe and others.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, David.
Okay.
Wonderful presentation.